And then let's see. The question says the total number of incorrect answered questions. We should return that as well, or display that as well. And a list showing the question numbers of the incorrectly answered questions. So let's create a function for that as well. Let's create a function. Let's call this determine, let's see, get incorrectly answered questions. Let's call it get incorrectly answered questions. This is not the actual, this is not the count of it. This is like the actual question numbers. Let's call it get incorrectly answered question numbers. Let's call it that, just so it's clear what this function is doing. I know these are long names, but it clears, kind of specifies or makes clear what you are trying to do. So get incorrectly answered question numbers. Okay. So it's going to be similar to this here. We're going to do something similar. So in order to know the question numbers, then we know we need to again have the exam correct answers list, and also we need the student correct answers list in order to compare them and see which ones were answered, which ones weren't. So I'm going to create a parameter list similar to this. We need the exam correct answers. So I'm going to create a parameter. I'm going to call it exam correct answers, just like what we had above. I don't need this comma here. So I need the exam correct answers list, and I also need the student correct answers list. Let me just copy this, paste it. All right, so again, it doesn't matter that these parameter names are the same. They're considered different because they're in two different functions. They don't see each other at all. All right, and we're going to basically go through, we're going to do something similar to this. Basically, we're going to get the number of questions. The number of questions is going to be equal to basically the length of any of them. If there are 20 exam correct answers, then there'll be 20 user answers as well. So we're going to do something similar to that. The length, let's get the length of any of them. I'm going to use the exam correct answers list. Is going to be equal to how many questions there are. So number of questions, I need this place to store how many questions there are. So number of questions is going to be equal to the length of, let's say, the exam correct answers list. And then we're going to loop through, the number of questions times, just like this. So I'm going to call this, it's basically going to be the same. Current exam question index in range. And the range is going to iterate this many times, number of questions times, but it's going to assign the appropriate or the right indices to this. All right, so I'm meant to type question index. All right, it's going to assign the right index or indices to this as it's iterating. So while we're going through each two lists, what we want to do is we want to this time not say if the student correct answers list is equal to the exam correct answers. We don't want to do that. We want to do something similar to that. We want to say if, while it's comparing two particular answers, if the answer is not equal to, for example, if the student answer is not equal to the exam answer, then we know that particular question wasn't answered correctly, right? And then we keep track of those questions. So for current exam question index in range, let's use something similar to that. If at any time the student, the particular answer we are on for the student, using the current question index here, if it's not equal to, the way you type not equal to is an exclamation sign and an equal sign. So if it's not equal to, the exclamation sign stands for not. So if it's not equal to the particular answer we have for the exam correct answers, we are referring to the particular answer using the current exam question index. If it's not equal to that, then we can keep track of those question numbers. I'm going to create a list to kind of keep track of those. So up here, I'm going to create a list. I'm going to call this list incorrect answers let's say incorrect question numbers let's call incorrect question numbers list. Okay, incorrect question numbers list. You can call it anything. Initially, it's going to be equal to an empty list. All right, so if at any time the two answers are not the same, then we know that there's an incorrect answer. So let's store that question number in this list. Well, I'm exceeding this line here. I want to break it somewhere around here. I'm going to type in the backslash first and hit enter. So if at any time that's the case, these two answers are not the same, then I'm going to append that question number to the incorrect question numbers list. So incorrect question numbers list dot append. And what do I want to append to this list is the question number. Now we have the current exam question index. That's what's keeping track of the particular answer for these two lists. So if at any time the index is 0, that is really referring to the first question. If at any time the index is 1, that's really referring to the second question. Okay. So we don't want to just store the index because that would be the wrong question number. If we store 0 for referring to the first question, that's really not the question number. So if the index is 0, because it's referring to the first number, let's add 1 to it. If the index is 1, because it's referring to the second question, then let's add 1 to it. If the index is 19, for example, then it's referring to the 20th item. So let's add 1 to the index so we can store the actual question numbers in the incorrect question numbers list. So we're going to take the particular index we are on, and add 1 to it. And this will actually store the right question numbers to the incorrect question numbers list. So by the time this loop is done, outside the loop, we'll have all the incorrect question numbers stored here. And then let's go ahead and return it. Let's return a list containing all the incorrect question numbers. Okay. All right. So we're done with that function as well. And then now, because we have we can find the number of correct answers, the number of incorrect answers, we can determine if the student passed or failed. So over here it says, after the student's answers have been read from the file, the program should display a message indicating whether the student passed or failed the exam. So let's create a function for that as well. I'm going to define a function. I'm going to call it student passed exam. That's how I'm going to call it. So in order to determine if the student passed, over here it says a student must correctly answer 15 of the 20 questions to pass the exam. Okay, 15 of the 20 questions to pass the exam. So at least we know the pass mark. The pass mark is 15. If you get 15 or above, you've passed the exam. So I'm going to define a parameter for that. I'm going to call it pass mark. So we'll need that. And also, we will need the list containing basically all the student correct answers to determine how many there are, right? And so we need to create a parameter for that as well, which is going to be the student correct answers list. Okay. And in order to determine if the student passed the exam, you're going to have an if statement and say that if at any time the length, of this particular list, the length of the student correct answers list, if any time the length of that is greater than or equal to the pass mark, then let's let this function return the boolean true. Else, then because the student didn't pass, then let's return the boolean false. Okay, so the length of the did I type incorrect? Sorry. The length of the student correct answers list. That's what I meant, because that's what we're dealing with here. If the student correct answers list if it's more than, if the length of it is more than, or it's basically 15 or more. If it's greater than or equal to the pass mark, which is going to be 15, then return true or return false. That's what I tried to do. Don't worry, when we run this program, we'll find out any errors that we made. I made. Okay, so I think we're done with the basically the functions that, well, basically some of the things that this question is doing, or most of them, or if not all of them. So shown. So because we're going to be displaying all these values, the program says over here, it should then display the total number of correctly answered questions, the total number of incorrectly answered questions, and the list showing the question numbers of the incorrectly answered questions. Let's create a function that's going to just print out result. So I'm going to define a function. I'm going to call it print result, and that's all it's going to do for us. It's just going to print result. It's going to print result, and it's going to need what it's going to print. The question said it should then display the total number of correctly answered questions. So I'm going to create a parameter for the total number of correctly answered questions. I'm going to call this number of correctly answered questions. This is just the parameter name. You can call it anything you want. And then it said the total number of incorrectly answered questions as well. So number of incorrectly answered questions. That's going to be the next arguments that whoever calls this function needs to provide. And it says the total number, and the list showing the question numbers of the incorrectly answered questions, and a list here. And so it's going to also need a list containing the incorrectly answered question numbers. So let's say incorrectly answered question numbers list. Okay, let's call it that. I know the names are long, but it's just to be clear exactly what we're doing. And then as part of it, it should also determine, okay, it should, after the student has, over here, it should also display a message indicating whether the student passed or failed the exam. Okay, so I know I'm exceeding this line here, so I'm going to break it somewhere around here. Type in a backslash, hit enter. Still exceeding it, so I'm going to break it somewhere around here. Type in a backslash, hit enter. Okay. Now, let's start with whether the student passed or failed. We have a function here. In order to print out that, we will need certain values. Actually, so let's not start with that. Let's print out the number of correctly answered questions. Let's do that. Well, before we do any of that, let's see. One question here. Okay, so this is the function. Sorry, I was confused a little bit. I thought this was the main function. Anyway, so this is the print results function. Now we are going to assume whoever calls this function is going to provide all these values to us. So we'll have it. And so what we'll do here is print out the number of correctly answered questions. Okay, so let's do that. And so I'm going to say number of correctly answered questions a colon, and I'm going to concatenate it. This is still one argument. I'm going to concatenate it to the number of correctly answered questions here. It's going to be a number, but if you try to concatenate an int to a string this way, Python is going to, the interpreters are going to complain and say you can't do that. It can't do that. So you have to make sure this is an int. You have to make sure this is a string, right? When you try to concatenate a string to a string, it should be fine. So we need to make sure this is a string. So let's concatenate the string version. I'm going to call the str function around it, the string version of this value here. And then I'm going to type in a comma here. So this is an entire argument, so one whole argument here. So I know I'm exceeding this line. I'm going to break it somewhere around here. Type in a backslash, hit enter. Here. So let's see. Number of correctly answered questions. I want to break it around here. So backslash, hit enter. Okay. And then the next argument is going to be the number of incorrectly answered questions, right? I can continue here, but I know that it's going to be off. It's going to go off away from this line. So I'm going to continue to break it here. Type in the backslash, hit enter. So I'm going to type in number of incorrectly. Let's just make this a lowercase a. Number of incorrectly answered questions and I'm going to concatenate that to the string version of the number of incorrectly answered questions arguments that is going to be passed to this function when it's called. Exceeding this line here, so I'm going to break it somewhere around here, hit enter. So this is an entire argument too, okay, after the comma. So I'm going to provide a third argument, which is a list, or let's just end here. But the third argument is going to be a list containing all the incorrectly answered questions. So let's not print it here, of course we can't. We need to, it's going to be a list, and so if we have access to the list, we need to create a loop that's going to go through it. Let's go ahead and create a function that basically goes through any list and displays the values in there. Okay, so this, you can actually use this function and then pass in any list, and it's going to display the values in there. So I'm going to create a function. I'm going to call it print values in list, and it's going to take in a list. If you're going to print values in a list, then it's going to take in a list as an argument. So I'm going to create a parameter name. I'm going to call it any list, and I'm going to go through this list and display all the values. Now, there are so many ways you can go through a list. I normally like to use indexing. Don't worry about these lines because I'm not done with this function. So I like to use indexing to access elements in a list because it gives you more control. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to create a for loop. I'm going to create a target variable. If I'm going through this list, and at some point, then at each time I'm accessing the particular current value. I'm moving from one value to the next, to the next, to the next. I'm going to call this target variable current value index. So for current value index in range, I'm going to create a range of the length, just like what we did above, the length of this list, this any list here. So the list contains 20 items, then it's going to iterate 20 times, but each time it's going to assign the indices 0 to 19, okay, as it iterates. First time it's going to assign 0 to this all the way to 19. Okay, so each time what I want to do is display the value, the particular value based on the current index, we are on the loop. I'm going to refer to the list. I'm going to refer to the list and print out the current value using the current value index. All right. So over here in our print result function, after displaying these values, let's call this print result function. Print results function. And this print results function is going to take in a list. In this case, it's going to be our incorrectly answered question numbers list. I'm going to pass it to it, and it's going to basically display all our question numbers for us. Okay, we'll have to do some formatting later on, but it will work. All right, and also we have to determine whether the user passed or failed. So right above this, or we can do it under this as well. Let's do it under. So we have a function that does that for us. If the student passed exam, well, this returns a true or false. So I am going to, let's see here. So for that, let's not have it print directly in the print result. We will do that in the main function, or we will find out soon how we want to do it. So let's go ahead and create the main function. And the main function is basically where your program is. It's the function that calls every other function. Okay, and in most programming languages, they have a main function that basically that's your starting point of your program. And so it's good practice. It's recommended. It's essential that you have a main function that starts your program, has every other function that is going to be called. All right, so the very first thing we do is, because we said we didn't want to create a file that contains the student answers, we wanted to basically get the answers from the user. We created a function called store student answers in file. And so let's call that. And we know the store student answers in file function is going to need a file name to open. We are creating a file basically. And so down in my main function, that is a long program, I'm going to create the file name as a constant. I like to store values in constant and variables and all that. So I'm going to store it as a constant. I'm going to call it file_name. So by default, when you're naming constant, by popular convention, constants are named in uppercase, and if it's more than one word, there's a space separating them. So file name is going to be equal to, so let's see here, 1 second. So the question didn't really specify the file name, but let's call it. The question said over here, create your own text file to test application. This is the file that contains the student answers. So let's call it student answers.txt. That's the file name. And so we know that this store student answers in file function needs a file name. We have the file name stored here, so I'm going to provide it to it. We know it also needs the correct answers list. We know the question gave us the correct answers. So let's store that in a list above it. So I'm going to create a list. I'm going to call it correct answers list. I'm going to, bear with me here, I'm going to type in all the answers here. So I don't have to type in question 1A, question 2. I don't have to. I just type in the answers in order. Okay, so you can use single quotations. I'm going to use double quotations. So the first one is A, and I'm going to just refer from here to type in the answers. Actually, let's just make it a bit easier here. So I'm going to copy all the way from here to a space and just start pasting. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 20. And then I'll just change the value. So it's A, B, C, C. So I'll just fix it. Just bear with me here. A, C, D. A, C, D. And then B, A, D, C, A. And then D, C, B, B, D. Sorry, D, C. Oh, I'm confused. C, A. All right, D, C. Oops. B, B, D, A. Okay. Okay, so these are the correct answers for the actual exam, according to this. I'm going to break it somewhere around here, type in a backslash, hit enter. These are our correct answers. We have our file name. This just spaces out a little bit. Makes sense. So it's a bit clear. And our store student answers in file function needs a file name and the correct answers list. We have our file name. We've provided it already, and then we have our correct answers list, which I'm going to pass it also here. So again, it doesn't matter that this name here is the same as this name here. It doesn't matter. Again, they are considered different because you're in individual functions. Yes, they're in separate functions. So we know the store student answers file function basically creates the file. It stores all the student answers in that file and closes it. That's it. All right, so the question said we should, after the student answers have been read from the file, okay, hold on 1 second. It states the program should read the student answers for each of the 20 questions from a text file and store the answers in another list. So we created a function called read student answers from file to list. We created that. So I'm going to call that as the next function. And we know that that function needs the file name, so we can open it and read from it. And we have the file name here. This is the file that was created, so we want to open that file. I'm going to provide it that file name. And we know the read student answers from file to list function returns a student answers list. Returns that list. And so I'm going to create a variable which is going to store that list. I'm going to call it the same thing, student answers list. Okay, again, it doesn't matter, the names are the same. This is considered different. The scope of this is within the main function, and then the scope of the student answers list is within the read student answers from file to list function. Okay, so let's keep going. All right, so it says, after the student answers have been read from the file, the program should display a message indicating whether the student passed or failed the exam. A student must correctly answer, so that we'll get to that. A student must correctly answer 15 of the 20 questions to pass the exam. So let's get the number of correct answered questions, of correctly answered questions. It also says it should then display the total number of correctly answered questions. So let's get that, and it says the total number of incorrectly answered questions. So let's get those two values. We created functions for them. The first one is determine number of correct answers. Let's go ahead and call that here. We know that function, determine number of correct answers, needs the number of correct answers, right? Oops, let's hold on 1 second. Sorry, this is the number of incorrect answers. So we know the determine number of correct answers needs two arguments. The first is the exam correct answers, okay? It's the exam correct answers list, which we will have here, correct answers list. We should have called it exam correct answers list, but it's fine. It needs that, and so I'm going to pass it to this function. And the determine number of correct answers, the second argument it needs is the student correct answers list, which we have here, student answers list. I don't know why I call this student correct answers list. Well, it's the student answers list anyway, because I mean, I shouldn't have called it student correct answers list. It's the student answers list. Okay, so just bear in mind, when you're understand that it's just a list containing the student answers. It could be wrong. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be correct. Actually, that can be confusing. So let's see if we can. Let's see if it's going to cause problems fixing it. Yeah, there are a bunch. We use it in a bunch of places. So we use it here. We call it student correct answers list. Student correct answers list. Student correct answers list. Because it doesn't make sense, right? It's a list containing the student answers, not the correct answers. So let's name this, let's fix it. It's worth it. Let's fix it just so we don't get confused. Let's just remove the correct answers. The determine, just go through it and change it just so it's not confused. It doesn't confuse you. We move forward. So this is going to be the student answers list, not the student correct answers list, okay? We are keeping track of where they all are. The good thing is Wing 101 highlights where you've used that variable. So everywhere we have that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 places, let's change it to student correct answers list. Sorry, student answers list, not student correct. Let's change it to student correct answers list, all right? Just so it makes sense. Do I keep saying that? Let's change it to student answers list, not student correct answers list. Okay. Just so I don't lose track, I'm going to keep a snapshot of where these are. So student answers list. I'm going to make a copy of this. And let's kind of double click just to know where they are. Student correct answers list. So this is another one here. I'm going to change that. This is another one here. Another one here. Another one here. And another one here. So if you want, you can keep yours the same, but just know that student correct answers list is really just a list containing the student answers. It doesn't have to be correct. It can be wrong. But if you want to do what I did and change it, then be careful. Be careful you don't change anything else. It can be very difficult. The good thing, if you're using Wing 101, it's easier. So now I don't have anything called student correct answers list. It's really a student answers list. Okay. Sorry about that. Just wanted to make sure that it makes sense as we go forward. So determine number of correct answers needs these two arguments, and it's going to return the number of that's it here. It's going to return the number of correct answers. And so when it's returning it, we need a place to store it. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call it correct answers and store it in this variable here. I'm exceeding this line, so I'm going to break it somewhere around here, type in a backslash, hit enter. All right, and the next thing we want to get or figure out is the number of incorrect answers. We have a function here called determine number of incorrect answers. So I'm going to call that. And we know this function, determine number of incorrect answers, needs the number of correct answers, which we have here, correct answers. Actually, this is the number. Let's call this number of correct answers. So number of correct answers. Let's call this. We've only used this here. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Those are different. They don't see each other. These are different because the scope of it is within this determine number of incorrect answers function. So let's call this number of correct answers when we determine the number of correct answers, and then now the determine number of incorrect answers, okay, needs the number of correct answers which we have here. So let's pass it to this function, and it also needs, okay, the determine number of incorrect answers also needs a number of questions. So let's store the number of questions as a constant as well. Okay, over here I'm exceeding this line because I changed the name of this. So let's fix that. Let's just pull this back to where it was. Remove the backslash, and let's break it somewhere around here. Type in the backslash, hit enter. Still exceeding it, so I'm going to type in a backslash here, break it here, and hit enter. Okay, so determine number of incorrect answers. It needs the number of correct answers and the number of questions. So let's store the number of questions as a constant, just like we did here. I'm going to call it number of questions. And the number of questions, we can get that from how many answers there are. If there are 20 answers, that means there are 20 questions. So let's set that to the length of the correct answers list. The question gave us the correct answers list here. So if there are 20 answers, that means there are 20 questions. That's how we get a number of questions.